Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the panel discussion on cities and change. I hope that you're all safe and well despite this being a very challenging week in so many regions of the country with the pandemic, but these are important discussions and really pleased to be here today. My name is Claire Boychuk. I'm a member of the policy team at the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, and we're thrilled to be part of the Massey City Summit. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm joining you from Ottawa on the unceded traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people. I know that this conference is bringing together folks from many different regions of the country and even internationally. So I'd like to take a moment to encourage you to think about the traditional territory that you're joining us from for this conversation, which is so deeply rooted in place. And I'm pleased to introduce our esteemed panelists. Professor Anneke Smit is Associate Professor at Windsor Law and the founder and inaugural director of the Windsor Law Center for Cities. She is Academic Supervisor at the Windsor Law Cities and Climate Action Forum and Policy Clinic. Prior to joining Windsor Law, Dr. Smit held a lectureship at the School of Law, University of Reading, where she also completed her PhD. She holds a law degree from McGill University and completed her undergraduate studies at the University of Alberta. And Dr. Smit's research, teaching, and community engagement focuses on municipal law and policy, urban planning and property law, refugee law, and policy. She has worked with or acted as consultant to government, intergovernmental, and non-governmental organizations in Canada, the Balkans, and the former Soviet Union. And I know that the organizers will be posting these bios in the chat, so you can also follow along there. Professor Benoit Frate is a member of the Quebec Bar and associate professor at the Department of Urban Studies and Tourism at the Université du Québec à Montreal, where he teaches municipal law, urban planning law, and tourism law. His recent research and publications focus on the relationship between municipalities and human rights and the federal, provincial, municipal division of powers in Canada. His Shirk-funded PhD thesis at the crossroads of municipal law and human rights law was recently awarded the Médaille du Barreau de Paris. So welcome, Professor Frate. And finally, Professor Robitaille is a full professor in the civil law section at the University of Ottawa. His recent research and publications focus on the constitutional, federal, provincial, municipal division of powers on land use planning, the environment, transportation, and human rights. He also acts as pro bono lawyer in public interest litigation in constitutional environmental law. Too bad there hasn't been any of that happening lately at the Supreme Court. And has argued for environmental organizations at the Supreme Court of Canada. He's also counsel at DHC Avocat in Montreal and has been a member of the legal committee of the Quebec Environmental Law Center since 2014 and served at the City of Gatineau's Commission on the Environment and Sustainable Development. So for our session today, so thank you all for being here. Our panelists have prepared fascinating papers. So we're gonna start with presentations from Professor Robitaille and Frate, who have been looking at the kind of last 25 years of grants of municipal authority and the way that these have spread across the Canadian Federation. So we're going to start with history, and then we'll go to Professor Smit, who will take us to emergency powers, which is just so relevant right now, and the kind of current context for municipal powers in Canada. So we're very lucky to have both past and present, and I will now, without further ado, turn it over to Professor Robitaille and Frate. Thank you.
Many thanks, Claire. Let me start our PowerPoint. Voila. So good morning. Such a pleasure for David and I to be here at the summit. Many thanks, Claire, for this great introduction. David and I would like to extend our thanks to the organizers and also to our research assistant, Mr. Jack Little. So let me jump right to the point. Quebec, with the Municipal Powers Act enacted in 2006, followed Alberta and most other provinces in transforming the way it grants some powers to municipalities through statutes. A transformation from a very detailed and restrictive list of powers, sometimes referred to as the laundry list approach, to broad authority in certain domains. That explains the abundance of paper you see on screen representing the long lists inherent to the laundry list approach. Now, Quebec's Municipal Powers Act grants broad authority to local municipalities in 8 domains, but the concrete effects of this important shift, in other words, what it really changed, remains understudied. So as a starting point for future research, further research on these concrete effects, David and I are in the process of exploring the explicit mention of the goals, objectives, and desired effects of the MPA in both parliamentary debates and in court decisions. And this morning, we share with you preliminary findings. So first of all, some context about Quebec. Here on this slide, we ask, is Quebec an extreme case of a statutory straitjacket? An author in Quebec used the term jungle to refer to the municipal legislation in Quebec at one point. Since David and I are more science fiction fans, we like to see it as multiple constellations, hence the representation you have on screen. In all cases, it is true that more than 140 provincial statutes apply to Quebec municipalities, more than 275 provincial regulations. Here on screen, we highlighted a few of the big names, including the new kid on the block, the MPA, the Municipal Powers Act, the one of interest for us because it introduced this broad authority approach to Quebec. So this MPA transformed restrictive powers in general powers in 8 domains. But as we say, as we often say, a picture is worth 1,000 words. So let's move to what's changed in terms of the way power are granted, the way they're written before and after the MPA. So before the MPA was enacted, hundreds of sections granted powers in a detailed and restrictive way, both in the City and Towns Act and in the Municipal Code of Quebec, 2 still existing statutes that govern municipalities in Quebec. Those hundreds of sections were repealed and transformed in short sections that confer broad authority over 8 domains, including safety. So on screen, we brought back to life a few of these now repealed sections and the way they were transformed in the MPA on the right. By reading them, we can feel how dated and restrictive these sections were. The first and the last paragraphs are good examples. Let's take a look at them. So paragraph 34, the council may make bylaws to prevent any person from lighting or keeping a fire in any outhouse, pigsty, barn, shed, or other building, otherwise than a chimney or a metal stove. Paragraph 39, the council may make bylaws to regulate or prohibit the use of firecrackers, torpedoes, Roman candles, we had to Google that one, skyrockets, or other fireworks. So restrictive and dated, and by dated, we mean it. We were able to retrace the origin of those sections back to the first version of the Cities and Town Act, so an act that dates back to the 19th century. And they were there, highlighted in yellow, exactly framed, drafted the same way. The only one we couldn't find was the Roman candle one, apparently not a municipal issue at the time. Now, moving back to the right side of your screen, those sections on safety and many hundred others in other fields have been transformed to what we see, something much smaller, shorter, a local municipality may adopt bylaws in matters of safety. Now, this section and others have to be read with our section 2 in mind. That states that under this act, municipalities are granted powers enabling them to respond to various changing municipal needs in the interests of their citizens. The provision of the act are not to be interpreted in a literal or restrictive manner. So that being said, as I said at the beginning, David and I are interested in understanding the concrete effects the MPA had. And as a starting point, we decided to analyze parliamentary debates on what was at the time Bill 62. So during 2004 and 2005, studied before the provincial legislature. So we went through several days of debates looking for explicit mentions of goals, objectives, and desired effect for the MPA. And we were able to identify multiple explicitly stated goals, objectives, and desired effects. And we arranged them here on screen in a few groups. So on the upper left, we can see structural motivation, right? Such as simplification, modernization of the law, in part with new vocabulary that is easier to understand. On the upper left, we see the idea of increased flexibility, increased innovation for municipalities working with this new framework, in part with what we have in the middle, because fewer modifications to statutes should be needed with this new framework. Another idea identified by the minister sponsoring the bill was the idea of emulation, of exchange of best practices between municipalities, since the recipe is no more prescribed by the provincial legislature. Mentions of a new partnership, a new relationship between the municipal and the provincial were also found in the debates. So these multiple goals and objectives found in parliamentary debates are helpful for us in order to understand the context of the adoption of the MPA, but could also serve, we feel, as indicators in order to monitor the concrete effects of the MPA in future research. We'll now turn to David, who will present in a nutshell what we found out in court decisions. Now, at this point, our interest was to find explicit mentions of the shift brought by the MPA. But as you can see on screen, our journey began years before the MPA's enactment in 2006, more precisely in 1994, because it marks the enactment of Alberta's new Municipal Government Act, but also the famous McLaughlin dissent in Shell v. Vancouver. David?
Thank you, Benoit. Indeed, when controlling the validity of bylaws and resolutions, the Supreme Court of Canada has developed standards of review that reflect the true nature of 21st century's municipalities. Since municipalities are administrative body under the provincial jurisdiction, they cannot exceed their delegated powers. So a strict judicial control will limit municipal autonomy, while a benevolent control will give municipalities more space to pursue their role. And as Benoit mentioned, the starting point of our analysis on this point is Shell Canada product, a case of 1994, and it was a 4-3 judgment. And we can see in this judgment two opposite visions of municipalities. In that case, the Vancouver City Council, pressed by citizens, has adopted two resolutions to protest against Shell Canada for its commercial relation with the discriminatory South African regime during the apartheid. The resolutions made Vancouver a Shell-free zone and stated that the city will no longer do business with Shell until its disinvestment from South Africa. The reason of the majority of the court, under the pen of Justice Sopinka, revealed what we think is a thin perspective on municipal democracy. Indeed, the majority declared the two resolutions ultra-virus, so it means illegal, because no express and explicit delegations of power were found in the Vancouver Charter. The majority also held that trying to have a foreign political influence was not a legitimate municipal purpose. So you can imagine that if Shell Canada product is today considered an important decision, it is due to the insightful vision of municipal democracy expressed by Justice McLaughlin. And we can say that, or consider that from this descent, the doctrine of ultra-vires started to progressively collapse in Canadian jurisprudence. According to former Chief Justice, there was no need of an explicit and express delegation of power for the Vancouver Council to act, because the general wording of the Vancouver Charter, and especially its good government clause, was amply sufficient. And contrary to Justice Sopinka, Justice McLaughlin favors a broad vision of municipal legitimate purposes and a liberal interpretation of provincial laws in order to avoid excessive judicial interference with democratic decisions, and also avoid excessive litigation costs and uncertainties due to judicial action, and reflect the true modern nature of Canadian municipalities. So for Justice McLaughlin, the collective expression of citizens through the municipal council was a perfectly legitimate municipal purpose. She then concluded that declaration of invalidity of municipal decision should only occur in clear cases of excess of jurisdiction. 6 years later, in the case Nynamo, the Supreme Court of Canada reached a compromise between the Sopinka and McLaughlin approaches in Shell. According to the court, two standards of review should apply in the judicial control of municipal decisions. First, inspired by Sopinka in Shell, the court noted that municipalities have no legal expertise and that local councillors are politically motivated and not impartial. For these reasons, the court held that a correctness standard should apply to decide if the province had delegated to the municipality the power to act over a specified matter. This means that the municipality cannot make any error in law in interpreting the extent of its power, except for its decision to be declared ultra-vires. However, inspired by Justice McLaughlin in Shell, the court stated in Nynamo that a reasonableness standard must apply to control the validity of municipal decisions taken within their delegated powers. This standard reflects, according to the court, the fact that municipal councillors are democratically elected and that they better know the needs and concerns of their community. A year after Nanaimo, in the case Frate, the Supreme Court approved the McLaughlin's dissent in Shell, stressing the importance of local governance and deciding that explicit devolution of powers is not necessary to the validity of a bylaw or resolution. Indeed, local POG clauses general wording is amply sufficient, according to Justice Leroux-Dubé, for a municipality to act for the general welfare of its citizens, except stated otherwise by the legislator. We will have to wait until 2004, so 10 years, for the Alberta 1994 legislative reform to finally make its way to the Supreme Court. In its short but crucial decision, the Supreme Court acknowledges that a broad and purposive approach to the interpretation of municipal powers has been embraced by a Canadian court, while at the same time, several provinces have moved away from the laundry list, choosing instead to confer them broad authority over general defined matters, giving municipality greater flexibility in fulfilling their statutory purposes. Now turning to the Quebec jurisprudence, particularly judgments, as mentioned Benoit, in which courts explicitly acknowledge the 2006 reform in Quebec, we can preliminarily conclude that this reform had the interpretation it deserves. Indeed, as an example, in 2011, in the case Wallot, the Quebec Court of Appeal noted that if the case law traditionally teaches that municipalities only have the powers that have been expressly delegated to them, this statement now need to be nuanced. And the Quebec Court of Appeal even goes further in another case in 2015, emphasizing that this act, the Municipal Powers Act, marks a major political shift and represents a radical change and a complete break with the past. So as we can see from our presentation, we can say that a shift of presumption has occurred, at least in some area of jurisdictions. While municipalities were traditionally presumed to have no power outside of the explicit words of provincial statute, they are now presumed, at least in some domains delegated in broad terms, to have all the power they need for the good government, the needs and interests of their collectivities, except those expressly withdrawn from their hands by the legislator. If this evolution has certainly enhanced the autonomy of Canadian municipalities, they are still, at least on a legal standpoint, under the complete will of the provinces. So we then agree with Mossonier and Baker when they wrote that while we would not say that municipalities are a third constitutional level of government, we suggest it might be considered at 2.5. So Benoit, I let you the final word.
Thank you, David. So at this point of our research, we can identify clear and strong signals in both parliamentary debates and court decisions regarding the shift brought by the MPA. That being said, several questions and caveats remains. In terms of questions, we have several as we endeavor into the search for concrete effects of this new method, including how courts treated challenges to bylaws adopted under the MPA. As for legal caveats, a few exist, one of them being that the power needed by a Quebec municipality might still be located beyond the broad powers they receive in the MPA. After all, not all powers were converted from restrictive to broad. So in other words, still a lot of work to do around the topic that we find most fascinating. Thank you. Merci beaucoup. Our emails are on the screen. Please do not hesitate to reach out for questions or comments. Thanks again. Merci.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Perfect. Great. Thank you so much. Thanks to Claire and to the organizing team of this summit. Merci à David et Benoit aussi for your very interesting work that I will follow up on. It's a pleasure to be here today with you and to share some of the thoughts, based on my team's ongoing research on state of emergency governance and cities at the Windsor Law Center for Cities. Let me first acknowledge with gratitude that I come to you today from the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy, the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi, otherwise known as Windsor in current terms. I want to acknowledge as well, as did David and Benoit, the work of my research assistants. I'll leave that to the paper, but there have been numerous both current and former students working on this ongoing project. And I want also to thank Alex Flynn from Allard Law at UBC and an organizer of this conference for her earlier thoughts. We collaborated on an op-ed about a year ago on this topic for the Toronto Star, and that was very much the starting point of this work. This week's summit has been focused around new powers, what new powers and frameworks are needed to support Canadian cities in 2021. Our contribution to this discussion is an analysis of the emergency powers held by cities and their place within the power relationship that is delegated power from the province. Our paper will look at some of the interplay between provincial and municipal and provincial power, some of the challenges that have occurred during the COVID-19 crisis, and conclude with recommendations for legislative reform, both by provinces, as well as steps that may be taken within the current framework by cities themselves to strengthen good governance and human rights protection, even during these declared emergencies. The argument is that the emergency has strengthened the argument for greater regular powers for cities, but it has also highlighted the need for strengthened and clearer emergency powers for cities. COVID-19 has shone light through the glaring holes in Canada's emergency powers legislative framework, in particular relating to cities. The Canadian Urban Institute in its City Watch program has followed 65 of the largest cities in Canada and found that 58 of them declared a state of emergency, most for the first time in modern history during COVID, relying on powers granted by provincial legislation, of course. While arguably an important tool in the early days of the pandemic for mayors and heads of municipal council to act quickly to protect public health, these skeletal legislative frameworks also enable decision-making which could override some of the normal democratic checks and balances, and sometimes have clashed with provincial orders and or those of local health units. At the same time, municipalities have faced some of the most challenging decisions, as we know, during the pandemic. And both the pandemic and some of those decisions have affected residents unequally, as we've heard from several panelists already today, with already vulnerable residents, including members of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, BIPOC communities, more deeply affected by the pandemic than others. We know that decisions made during the emergency, while in some cases emergency level decisions may be likely to stick, and in some cases that's celebrated as it's informed and hastened change. But we have to also be aware of the governance structures under which this has happened. So the way I like to think of it is that Canadian emergency governance during COVID-19 has been both a patchwork quilt and a political hot potato, and one which is in need of reform in the context of this wider call for stronger city-led powers. The existence and acceptance of governmental emergency powers in democratic states is widespread and longstanding. As Elizabeth Goitein put it in a 2019 article, the premise underlying emergency powers is simple. Emergency powers are meant to give the government a temporary boost until the emergency passes or there is time to change the law through normal legislative processes. Gross and Allen note that what most models of emergency governance have in common is flexibility, and the enabled continued adherence to the principles of the rule of law and faithfulness to fundamental democratic values while providing the state with adequate measures to withstand the storm wrought by the crisis. In his 1972 article, Tarnopolsky noted that models varied internationally, but most permitted some restriction of civil liberties in pursuit of the management of an emergency. In Canada, the use of emergency powers has been quite understudied. In 1995, emergency powers expert John Scanlon wrote that whatever the cause, the neglect seems unfortunate. He went on to say that, well, of course, emergency powers originated in Canada at the federal level, then trickled down to the provinces. The federal level emergency powers have been largely unused. And in fact, when the Emergencies Act replaced the War Measures Act in 1980, it has remained uninvoked. As between municipalities and the provinces, both legislative frameworks and practice have historically been characterized by ambiguity. By 1995, according to Scanlon, most Canadian municipalities had formulated and enacted their own emergency plans, yet even with such plans in place, leadership and organizational practice on the ground has been varied in response to a range of local disasters. In reference to 1989 forest fires in Manitoba, Scanlon notes that, quote, the municipalities had decided if people should leave, but the province took over and decided if they could return home. Some of that is the flexibility that's needed in emergencies. Schneider notes in a 1942 US wartime article that, quote, when bombs fall, you may be certain that the citizenry will not be concerned with such legalisms that cities may not act except as specific prior authority has been granted by the state. While clarity in emergency powers is the goal, therefore, a certain flexibility may be necessary in implementation. Public health emergencies, however, we've seen are a different beast, so to speak. Amidst the range of emergencies contemplated thus far and experienced historically, public health is always a key element of the response, but it may also be the emergency itself. Health-related public emergencies in recent history have, of course, included the SARS pandemic, the H1N1 pandemic, the Ebola virus, and the Zika virus, and of course, COVID-19 falls in this category. The line between public health and other emergencies is not a clear one. Justice Archie Campbell, in his 2006 SARS Commission report for Ontario, wrote that it is artificial to try to distinguish between public health emergencies and general emergencies. Indeed, there is no such thing as a pure public health emergency. Conversely, there is no such thing as a pure general emergency. For this reason, Justice Campbell recommended against separate legislation to address public health emergencies in Ontario, an approach which was largely taken up in the reform legislation. His report is a fascinating read in the context of COVID-19. Now let me turn to COVID-19 specifically. COVID-19 has seen emergency powers invoked by governments worldwide. Joelle Grogan in a study surveyed 74 countries, all of which had enacted emergency legislation of some sort during COVID-19. Sorry. In some cases globally, the emergency powers have been tied to public health. In some, they are more general emergency powers, and in some, like in Canada, there has been a mixture of both. Concerns have been expressed during the year-long pandemic in numerous countries that once exercised emergency powers may quickly become the norm, maintained or resorted to more readily than had been the case in previous. Alan Green notes in the context of the European Convention on Human Rights that, quote, emergency powers have a worrying tendency of becoming permanent. Ronan Cormacan notes in a 2020 article that law still has a role during the emergency and argues for a clear drafting of emergency principles to ensure that emergency powers remain strictly emergency ones. Now to that familiar face. In Canada, COVID-19 emergency governance has varied widely. By July 2020, all provinces and territories had declared a state of emergency and/or a public health emergency. And in March 2021, all provinces continued to be under a state of emergency or comparable public health emergency declaration, most having been so consistently since the first declaration. Ontario, we know, ended its state of emergency in the second half of 2020, but redeclared in January 2021, and Alberta did similarly, ending, in fact, earlier in 2020, but redeclaring in November 2020. Provincial and territorial legislation across the country governs municipal, I'm sorry, my screen is jumping on me here. Provincial and territorial legislation across the country governs municipal level emergency powers. As an example, under the Ontario Emergency Management and Civil Protection Act, Ontario's municipalities are required to create an emergency plan adopted by law by council. The plan may be set in motion by a mayor by a declaration of emergency under Section 4 of the EMCPA. And the head of council or mayor also has the authority to extend and terminate the emergency. A state of a municipal emergency generally can be declared even in the absence of a provincial state of emergency. However, in most cases during COVID-19, provincial and municipal states of emergency have been concurrently in effect. It's perhaps no surprise that tensions between provincial orders and municipal orders have run through public decision-making during this period. In Saskatchewan, local orders made by the city of Regina and the town of Gravelbourg were overturned by the province because they were stricter than the provincial standard. We know that in Toronto and Peel region, there have been ongoing questions about the jurisdiction of the medical officer of health to make decisions vis-a-vis the provincial medical officer of health, with protests made sometimes by the local medical officers of health that they do not have the power to take more restrictive measures. Some advocates also urged the city of Toronto to take action under the city's emergency management plan to restrict housing evictions under its declared state of emergency, while municipal lawyer and academic John Mascarin and Toronto Mayor John Tory both took the position that this would exceed municipal powers since it related to provincial legislation. We know that this question of jurisdiction continues to play out as recently as yesterday with the closing of schools by Peel region. Further, in the case of the COVID-19 pandemic, not only have there been tensions related to the powers of municipalities, there have also been conflicts or duplication between the exercise of public health powers, either normal public health powers such as those exercised in Ontario under the Health Protection and Promotion Act, or public health emergency powers, and on the other hand, the emergency powers exercised by municipalities under emergency powers legislation. The effect of this is that at any given time, a resident of Ontario in certain municipalities could be governed by several pieces of legislation, of emergency legislation or declarations, and several different orders related to COVID, emergency orders coming from several different bodies or levels of government. It's perhaps no surprise then that the public has been confused and governments have been able to pass the buck back and forth on emergency orders. Further, municipalities and mayors have expressed varying justifications for declaring or maintaining a local state of emergency, which has led to differing approaches to governance under the orders. These justifications from public reports range from streamlined decision-making, messaging to the public or to higher levels of government about the seriousness of the situation, the impact on collective agreements and redeployment of employees, the ability to permit closure or repurposing of municipal facilities, and the ability to restrict movement in and out of the municipality. If, as recent research has also suggested, a community's resilience during and following emergencies improves in correlation with the effectiveness and clarity of communications during the emergency, then this lack of clarity may have a longer-term impact on community well-being after COVID. A mayor or emergency team, of course, is not required to exercise all of the emergency powers available to them, yet once in place, those powers are theirs to use. And we know from earlier research that we published in September of 2020 in our States of Emergency report that surveyed public and media reports on municipal governance, that many of these powers have been used. Council meetings were canceled, as well as committee meetings. Consultations were held rather than voting meetings, and public consultations were also canceled. Human rights organizations from the CCLA to Human Rights Watch have called out, Amnesty, I should have said, have called out governments, including municipal levels of government, for infringements of human rights related to these orders, making the lack of clarity all the more worrying. So let me turn then to potential reform of emergency powers. Michael De Silva, in the health powers context, has argued recently that rather than creating the need for greater or more powers, emergencies simply reflect existing tensions and must be evaluated through that framework. He says one cannot simply point to the existence of an emergency to trigger a new criteria for evaluating authority claims, but must examine how existing principles apply in a given setting. Jocelyn Stacey has written that while the traditional understanding of emergency powers is that they are to be used minimally until the status quo may be reestablished, declarations of emergency may in fact be the beginning of something entirely new. US legal historian John Fabian Witt states in his 2020 book, American Contagions, quote, "We can use epidemics as occasions for addressing the glaring inequities they illuminate. We can level up rather than down. The choice is ours." But if it is the case that broader systemic change may be possible as a result of the pandemic, it becomes all the more important that democratic and participatory governance during the pandemic be clear and strong. Emergency level municipal decision-making is not only making difficult choices that constrain human rights and civil liberties, but also setting a path for municipal governance in years to come, and the stakes have never been higher. Clearer articulations of emergency powers themselves are therefore necessary at both provincial and municipal levels, as well as at the local public health levels where these are at arm's length from the municipality. As Witt has written, new germs help make new laws and institutions. Acute emergencies have historically led to periods of reflection and reform on emergency powers. Following the 1998 ice storms, the Y2K fears, and 9/11, Ontario amended its emergency legislation and created the Emergency Management Act. Justice Campbell's SARS report in 2006 led to the creation of the current emergency management legislation in Ontario, and the City of Toronto reviewed or amended its emergency plan almost yearly between 2006 and 2013. I'll finish just with a couple of thoughts, and I've left a couple of screens at the end which contain some more specific recommendations. These are also laid out in the paper, which I think is shared online, and happy to take these up in the discussion. But let me just conclude by saying at the provincial level, clearer language is necessary in some of the provincial legislation to define what constitutes an emergency and to acknowledge that different measures may be necessary depending on the type of emergency. The commentary from Justice Campbell's report, and in particular his recommendations specific to public health emergencies, deserve further consideration. As Justice Campbell stated, it's not enough to be prepared generally or to develop generic one-size-fits-all emergency plans. An emergency plan for an ice storm will be no use in an influenza pandemic. An influenza pandemic plan will be no good in an ice storm. Specific emergency plans are required for specific threats. My colleague at Windsor, Edwin Tam, as an engineering professor, has written that the response measures to a pandemic therefore permit the selective curtailing of targeted municipal systems to reduce transmission. In this way, they are different than, for example, an earthquake or a terrorist attack. Tough choices have to be made, and having the right people at the table is important. Having a legislative framework which provides for that and guarantees that is important. This is on the province, but there's also possibilities for cities. Again, I'll leave you primarily with the slides. But just to say that at the city level, even in the existing framework, there is potential. There's potential for a municipality to decide under what types of emergency situations it will declare a state of emergency. There is the potential for a municipality to commit to adhering to normal decision-making frameworks as much as they can during the pandemic. And there can be also a commitment to prioritizing public participation in that decision-making during states of emergency. That's on the province to lay that out in the legislative framework, and it's on municipalities to make those choices for themselves in the existing framework. I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you to all of our panelists. There's so many interesting threads that I want to pick up on, and I also invite our participants to leave questions for our panelists in the chat, which I can share. So I want to start first of all with a question to Professor Frate and Robitaille, which is, I think so often in the kind of popular media, we get into this idea of there being this finite amount of power for each level of government, and it's kind of a zero-sum game, as opposed to this kind of more multi-level cooperative federalism reality. And so I was wondering if you could kind of expand on the historical roots of this movement that you have documented towards broader grants of authority, which of course come from provinces to municipalities, and that started in Alberta and was, I know your paper includes these fantastic quotes from MLAs who are saying this is why it makes sense, and kind of turns that assumption on its head. So I'll hand it over to you now for that.
Thank you, Claire. Great question. Well, at this point, we limited ourselves to parliamentary debates for context, and more thoroughly at this point to Quebec. And in the province, the parliamentary debate showed that Quebec municipalities have been asking this for a long time, notably by invoking the Alberta example. The government on its side acknowledged the need for a new modern framework, more adequate to the reality of our times. That being said, on the question of giving new powers in the parliamentary debates, one can clearly feel the tension between the government and the opposition, but also with the municipal associations on the extent of these new powers. So the government often argued that it was not a question of attributing new powers. It was rather a question of giving greater flexibility within existing powers, which seems to us at first glance, David and I, to be a bit contradictory, since with this new flexibility, no more statutory modification should be necessary. It should also mean the possibility to exercise powers that were not previously expressly and restrictively granted. So in the parliamentary debates in Quebec, we see this tension all the time. And this is something we'll have to keep in mind while investigating the concrete effects, because from the start, that tension is there and we feel it many times. I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Okay, and we had a question from Principal Nathalie Desrosiers to Professor Smit. Is your conclusion that the power already exists, but municipalities are afraid to use it?
Merci, Madame Desrosiers. It's a great question, and I think that's what we're seeing playing out in discussions in the media in the last 24 hours and in the last several months. I think that the conclusion is that, there are powers there which can be used, and we've seen both local medical officers of health as well as local municipal councils take steps when they see that it's necessary. But what we seem to often see is a sort of a push and pull, again, with sort of a passing of the buck until the 11th hour, as someone described it yesterday, when we have schools closing at 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the day before the students are meant to return. because that power could land on either lap. Now, I mean, I think the points that Scanlon makes are important. Emergencies are just that, and in some cases, you just need bodies on the ground, and you need someone to take control. But I think one of the arguments here is this is a different kind of emergency. This is a longer term. These are nuanced decisions that have to be made. And so that sort of framework for decision making could be strengthened, and in particular, I think at the municipal or at the provincial level, sort of making clear what those some better lines of communication or decision making about whose decision is what, and also better procedural requirements when those decisions are being made.
Okay, I'm seeing so many good questions in the chat, so I'll just pick up on one of them. Has the move towards more positive interpretation of municipal powers led to problems of regional coordination when municipalities pursue their own interests, for example, in terms of planning and tax-based competition? I don't know if I welcome any of the panelists to speak to that question.
I think there's a lot for Debbie and Benoit there. I would just say, I think that is some of what we're seeing playing out on the emergency powers is sometimes local level governments saying this requires a regional approach, and so we don't want to step in. Therefore, Medical Officer of Health or Premier Ford, please do act. And likewise in other provinces, and but it does then obviously run the risk of a sort of an overly broad response when sometimes a regional one would be more useful.
And I'm also seeing a few questions, thank you, Professor Smit, around trilateral agreements and the kind of potential to bring everyone to the table to find this further clarity. And I don't know if anyone else wants to speak to any dimensions of trilateral agreements that they're seeing in their research and how they might relate to this. Okay, well, we can percolate on that one a little bit longer. I didn't want to miss the opportunity because all of you have this kind of background on climate dimensions. And I know that we've very recently heard from the Supreme Court on the federal regime on carbon pricing. And I think considering the context of this summit and some of the other panels looking at the climate emergency, wanted to give you the opportunity to kind of weigh in on both from the perspective of Professor Frate and Robitaille on these kind of broader grants of authority and that trend and how that sets us up for environmental regulation. And then also from Professor Smit and the kind of huge number of climate emergencies that have been declared across Canadian municipalities and just that kind of legal infrastructure to approach these issues in the coming years.
Debbie, do you want to take that first?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Thank you, Anneke. Okay. Yeah, that's a great question. Benoit and I think that the vision of federalism supported by the Supreme Court is well balanced and nuances, and because it stressed the complementary role of each level of government. As we all know, in Frate, the Supreme Court of Canada sent, I think, a clear message to all level of government in saying that the protection of the environment is a new question that involved the responsibilities of all level. So I think there's a role for the federal government to act as a national leader to make sure every province is doing its parts while respecting the expertise and the autonomy of provinces on their territory to regulate their industries, their transportation, natural resources, factories, etc. And for their part, municipalities are often considered as problem solvers on the local level, and they don't necessarily have time to wait for national or provincial policies, which demand time and negotiation. So maybe on a more limited territorial scale, municipalities can more rapidly implement more specified and targeted municipal policies and program to protect the environment. So Canadian federalism, in insisting on cooperation between each level, I think is creating the good a great regime to fight against climate change and recognize the role of every level of government.
I'm happy to jump in there too and take a slightly different tack, which is the climate crisis was actually my sort of entry point into my team's work on states of emergency. We were already working on a crisis and crisis level governments at the municipal level, but that was the climate crisis. And what we have now is this sort of complex crisis scenario where, as many have said today already, we have affordable housing crisis, we have a systemic racism crisis, we most certainly have a climate crisis. And now on top of this, we have a public health crisis. I mean, that sort of healthy cities framework, I think, is a really good one to think about. That's the just transition or build back better are good frameworks to bring all of that together. But there's a tension between trying to do all of that together and at the same time having fewer voices at the table and having confusion over what level of government is acting, so that we're ending up making these fast decisions. And I think this morning, there's reference to bike lanes as one example. We're making some great decisions about urban infrastructure that are great for climate, but we're making them without the consultations that would allow us to ensure that we're bringing all neighborhoods on board, that the bike lanes are going where they need to address communities that have been historically underserved. So I think that that tension is a big one, and that just, I think, returns to that question of what kind of an emergency is an emergency, such that and for how long, such that emergency legislation is sufficient or is appropriate. It is different to put something in place for those first weeks after a crisis, but to do this for years on end, it might be quite a different scenario and might require different and more nuanced tools. In Windsor, where I am, public transit was canceled for more than a month without any consultation, and that was, again, a decision that kind of gave rise to some questions about the extent to which those democratic and public participatory governance powers should be limited. And I think the same is true when you're thinking about these bigger crisis issues.
Well, thank you all for those excellent and thoughtful responses. I'm overwhelmed by the audience participation here, so I'll pick out another question to Professor Frate and Robitaille. Did you find any judicial decisions declare municipal regulations ultra vires? Did you see that question? I think that's from Principal Desrosiers. And I'll throw out another one here to Professor Smit, so you guys can decide who wants to jump in on these questions. Does your research show that emergency declarations kind of erode democratic processes and kind of the experience from 9/11 and previous kind of security legislation? And yeah, let's go with those two.
Okay, thank you, Claire, and thank you, Principal Desrosiers, for your question. So yes, we found judicial decisions in which courts declared ultra vires some municipal regulations. We're I think at the beginning of our research on that point, because as Benoit mentioned earlier, the first part of our research really focused on the explicit recognition of the reform, but to fully embrace the effects of the reform in Quebec or in other provinces, we have to look in all the judgments in municipal law of the courts. So we will have to analyze if after 2006, after the reform of 2006, is it more difficult to to win against municipalities on notion as unreasonableness, bad faith, disguise expropriation. Not sure if it's the good term in English. In French, we say expropriation déguisée. So those are all. So, like Benoit often said, the devil lies in the details. So we will have to analyze all the decisions that court have written in Quebec. But yes, they are decisions in which court declared travers as some municipal rule bylaw. But we feel that it might be more difficult than it used to be. And there's other research in Canada and other provinces that's starting to realize that yes, it's really difficult now to win against a municipality acting within its sphere of jurisdiction. But in Quebec, we have to do more research to fully to be absolute or have a clear cut on that point.
Thank you. And just on the question of whether these emergency measures are likely to stick, I mean, I think that's the research initially seems to suggest that it will, based on international context as well, or at least that you know, I think when you're dealing with a level of government where the powers are so tenuous to begin with, there is always the fear that those powers will, you know, so restrained, or those procedures so restrained will continue to be so. And even if not, even if they don't seep in as they shouldn't to regular governance, and in fact are just that bow that will, the branch that can bend instead of breaking, you know, the research tells us that we will see more of these pandemics as time go on, and more regularly. And so I think, you know, all the more reason to know, now that mayors and councils know that this is a tool available to them, and that the emergencies will come more regularly, that they also know, you know, and have a clear idea of what governance should look like, and a default position, which is that there should be good governance, and participatory governance with the right people at the table as much as possible.
Okay, well, we have only a few minutes left, but there's a wonderful question from Kristen Good, who's written a lot about this topic, and she says, for Professor Frate and Professor Robitaille, you made the point that our system has 2.5 orders of government. Drawing on others who've written about this, does this mean that municipalities have quasi-constitutional status in provincial constitutions? And could you elaborate? And I know we have a hard stop at noon, so I want to thank everyone for being here. I'll let you all have the last word. Encourage folks to attend the next panel, and over to you in case we get cut off.
Okay, I'll try to be short on that one. Okay, that's a really good question. I don't think they have a quasi-constitutional status, but that will be a good avenue to argument in courts. That's a very interesting point. I think that if saying that it's a 2.5 order, it's because of many factors, political ones. We know that if municipalities are under the will of provincial governments, legally speaking, they have a real and concrete force of negotiation on a political standpoint. So that we cannot just ignore the politics and focus on the law. We have to realize that municipalities also have a great political autonomy, I think, or a political voice. And it's also because they, Mossonier and Baker think that, and as I said, more research are needed on that point, but they feel that it's more difficult today since this evolution that Benoit and I explain. It's more difficult today to win in a judicial fight against municipalities. So that's why we can say it's a 2.5. But ultimately, if the provinces want to retrieve powers from municipality, they are able to do it. So that's as Professor Flynn, there will be a panel tomorrow, I think, on the modification needed to to give municipalities a more important role in the Constitution.
Okay, I think we'll have to close there. Thank you all so much. Thank you to our panelists for the excellent papers and presentations. And I'll look forward to seeing all of you in the coming days at more of these events.